Welcome to the Mom Spectrum, where each week moms share their stories about motherhood, careers, and finding fulfillment. This show is to help moms feel more confident, because there are a million right ways to be a mom. I am your host, Stephanie Schindler. So today we have Erica Komisar, and I'm so excited. I'm really honored that she was willing to take the time to share her message with us. So she is a clinical social worker, a psychoanalyst, and parent guidance expert. She wrote Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters. So I first came across her book when my daughter was probably about 6 months old. And so I was working 10 hours a week at the time from home. So I had a nice balance, but was still struggling with the decision. So it was a really powerful book for me to read. And I'm just very impressed with your work and everything that you do. So that said, can you introduce yourself and your family a little bit more?
Yeah, I am a psychoanalyst and a parent guidance expert and an author. So I write books and I write articles for the Wall Street Journal. I am an op-ed writer for the Wall Street Journal on family issues. And really, I should tell you, I also have 3 children of my own. I'm married and I have really older children now. I have a 20-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 15-year-old. So I'm in a different phase, which is also why I'm writing a book about adolescence right now. But I wrote my book, Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters, because as a therapist, I was seeing a disturbing trend in my practice and in society, which was there was this incredible epidemic of mental disorders in children, a rise in mental disorders at an earlier and earlier age. Children were being diagnosed earlier, medicated earlier for things like ADHD and behavioral issues and depression and anxiety. And a very disturbing trend, which in my practice I was able to tie to the absence of mothers in children's lives on a daily basis. So I thought, right, let me look at the research to make sure this is not just a fluke in my practice. And what I found after looking at 13 years, I looked at neuroscience, epigenetics, psychoanalytic research, and attachment research. And it all basically backed up what I was seeing in my practice, which is that mothers are not just emotionally necessary to children in the first 1,000 days. They're actually biologically necessary. The development of things like emotional regulation and stress resilience and emotional security, which are the foundations of mental health. So that's why I wrote the book. And that's why I run around waving my arms and talking about how the first 3 years are important. I know a lot of people are talking about why the first 3 years are important, but they're not connecting it to mothers. Right. And so I felt that was a critical message.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious how your experience, of course you were working with other families, but I'm curious how your own experience being a mom influenced your work, both your research and also in your book.
Well, I mean, I would say I live by what I talk about because I had this idea from my book very early on in my career. I was a young psychoanalyst. I had very young children. I took as much time as I could off. I took 6 months off with each of my children, and then I went back to work something like an hour and a half a day. For the next 6 months. So for 6 months, and most of that time, I was doing phone sessions. So really, I walked the walk, as they say. I walked the talk. And then I was challenged with my own beliefs when I had this idea for the book. And I even talked to an agent at the time about it, and that was about 10 years before I actually wrote the book, and my children were little. I had 3 children, and then I realized that would take me away from my children, and I realized that I would be able to write that book at a later time. So I put the book away, and and said there will be a right time to do this, but it's not right now because it won't allow me to be emotionally and physically present for my children, which is what I really want to be. So I put the book away and I picked it up 10 years later, and nothing bad had happened in between that meant I couldn't pick it up again. And so my story is, I think, the story of many women who struggle to think, I don't want to lose my careers entirely, but I also know that life is long, and if we all live till 120 like Moses, or they tell us with medical care improving we will, that you have a very long time to have an impactful career, but you have a very short time, a very small window, critical window to make a major impact on the mental health of your children.
That is such a powerful statement. I think you're right. That's such a fear of so many new moms, that if I step away, I'm going to lose my whole career. So I love that you really are an example of how it is very possible to keep going. And and 6 months. And so it's interesting too. So you took 6 months off. So I am an American and now living in Canada. So in Quebec, I'm not sure if it's all of Canada actually, but a year of maternity leave is standard. It's interesting coming from the States. So my experience was I took 6 weeks off unpaid, and then went, and granted I was going back only a few hours, but still I was shocked at how difficult it was to go back. And I recognized that I was really privileged, honestly. But so I know a lot of your work too has to deal with U.S. legislation and wanting better maternity leave in the States. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's not just U.S. legislation. It's also, I work in other places in the world. I go to Sweden. I go to the U.K. I go anywhere where they'll listen to me when they're talking about policy. I would say, in fact, I've had a greater impact on policy in the UK than I have here. So funny enough, because they're more open. There's a lot of defensiveness here. There's a lot of talk about the importance of the first 3 years. There's a foundation called 0 to 3. I mean, there's a lot of talk about it. But when it really comes down to it, and when it really breaks down, what that means in terms of our society in America is daycare. Women should put their children in daycare earlier, go back to work earlier. Work will set you free, kind of thing. Funny, right? In a capitalist society. But in fact, that's the wrong message, because that message is not a message of the health of 0 to 3, because the health of 0 to 3 is really in the connection between you and your primary attachment figure. And if you're separated from that primary attachment figure for long periods of time, then it has reverberations and casts a long shadow on the rest of that child's life. So, yeah, we think about it all wrong in this country, and we don't want to pay for what we talk about. So it's a funny thing, right? So you'd say the liberals in this country don't support me because they see my message as being anti-feminist, which is ridiculous, because I myself have worked and modified my work and regulated it. But I would consider myself a feminist. I actually consider women who choose to mother as maternal feminists. It's choice, right? We want to have choice. In the old days, we didn't have choice. But in fact, we have a very strange value system in this country, which is, and the conservatives support my thinking, which is 0 to 3 is important for mothers to be around, but then they don't want to offer paid maternity leave to all women because it's expensive, but they don't want to offer it because, they don't want to put their money where their mouths are, kind of thing. So it's we're in a peculiar position in this country. Yeah. If you listen to the candidates right now in America, they're all talking about universal daycare. The sooner you can get that baby into a group institutional setting, the better society will be. And that's just a bunch of baloney, because what we know is that babies who are put into daycare very young end up with stress disorders. with attachment disorders, and then end up with behavioral problems and early signs of aggression and ADHD, which is a stress disorder. So, it's just our thinking about it is all wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been very interesting. I've just been reading a lot of what you've talked about with people and just what's out there on this. And it's very interesting, the political side of it, that it's just like, this is the research, it's what it says, and it has nothing to do with politics in a certain sense, that it just is what it is. Truth is truth, and whether your politics agree with it, that doesn't really change what the fact is and the effects that it's really literally having on people. So that's just such an interesting thing. And I didn't even really think about the aspect of how you're kind of stuck in the middle where it's like, yeah, that's very interesting. So I wanted to ask too, so I know that your book has received criticism. Did that surprise you, or did you kind of see that coming?
Well, I didn't know that it would. I didn't know that it would make people feel guilty. There's no way to get around it. If you alert women to their instincts that they may or may not be listening to, it's going to make them feel something. It's either going to make them feel relieved, which is something that a lot of women have felt in response to my book, which is they write me and they say, thank you for writing this book. You changed my life. Or, no one is supporting me. Even my family and my husband don't support me. And my instincts are telling me not to leave this incredibly neurologically fragile, vulnerable baby who needs me. And yet everything and everyone in society is telling me there's something wrong with me. So I have that audience. I also have women who are pulled in both directions, but who don't want to feel conflicted, and so it makes them feel guilty, or they suffer from postpartum depression and kind of escaped the postpartum depression by running back to work rather than looking straight in the face and getting treatment and finding out why being with their own child caused them such dark feelings of depression and boredom. So rather than deal with those feelings, they would run from them back to a job and say, right, I'll have somebody else care for my child. I'm not good at that. So it brings up certainly the idea that your baby needs you. Particularly, your children need you all throughout. That's the truth. If I had written a book called Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 18 to 25 Years Matters, I don't think anybody would buy my book. But in fact, I'm working on this book on adolescence now because your children do need you throughout, actually, just in a slightly different way. But there are critical windows, and one of those very critical windows is 0 to 3. So the idea that your children need you desperately in those first 3 years, it makes a lot of women feel guilty. So the responses that I get, which are defensiveness and anger, I don't really take them personally because I see them as a sign of women feeling conflicted and feeling defensively aggressive in response to their fear. It touches something in them, and something they don't want to look at. Yeah.
So going along with that, you've obviously dealt with all this criticism. So how have you responded to that, and what kind of advice would you give to moms who are facing criticism for their own choices and how they can better respond to that?
Well, the best way to respond is, I don't want to say not to respond, but I mean, I think if you've heard any of my interviews, I'm relatively calm in the face of the anger and the criticism. And maybe that also is my psychoanalytic training, because obviously we're trained to deal with people's angry and sad and conflicted and defensive feelings. So it's good training for what the book brought. But I would say the more secure you are in your choices, the less what other people think of you matters. I think that's in general in life. And I think if you're feeling under attack, if you're feeling persecuted by other people, if the environment, meaning other people in your environment, are bringing up painful feelings in you, I would say go talk to somebody so you can build up your internal resources. So you don't take it personally. So you don't feel it so much as an attack as you do the other person's conflict. So yeah, I would say get support to shore up who you are, because the more secure we feel with our choices, the less vulnerable we are to people's criticism. Makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. Thank you.
Yeah, the thing I would say is get support. I mean, I go and speak all around the world, but with organizations, women's organizations. There's one wonderful organization called Blue Ocean Women that gets women who are mothers together because they know that women who are mothers are not supported in this society, and it gets women all over the country into groups where they can support one another, communities of mothers who actually do believe what you believe and do support what you support. Yeah.
I love that. That's awesome. So too, like you said, and actually I've heard you say in other interviews that the book isn't meant to be don't work. It's about prioritizing. It's about valuing motherhood. And I just love that sentiment because it's so important. And it's just so true that motherhood has really become very devalued. So what is your advice to moms working, not working, about how they can make the most of their time with their children?
Well, yeah. So I'm funny about the term, and you didn't use it, and I'm so grateful you didn't use it. Thank you for not using the term quality time. I hate that term because all time should be quality time, and you can't really raise children with quality time alone. It has to be quantity and quality. So you wouldn't separate the two in any way, and you can't replace quantity with quality. However, if you're there a lot of the time physically and you're checked out emotionally, that's not good either. So you kind of need to be there as much as possible with your head in the game and your heart in the game. So, in terms of if you're working, if you either have to work or you enjoy your work, but you're still prioritizing your children and you're spending a lot of time with them, the best way is to remove distractions. I mean, I would say the best kinds of jobs for women who have young children are jobs where you don't have homework that you bring home with you, are jobs that you have control and flexibility in those positions. So where you can compartmentalize and say, I leave my work at work. Are jobs where you can work when your children work, when they're in school, eventually, even preschool and nursery school. Those are the best kinds of where if your child is sick, you don't have to feel guilty. You can say, I can't come in, or I'm not going to see patients or clients today, or control and flexibility. Those are the best kinds of positions for women to have who have children. And so, what I try to get women to think about is even not answer your question. So removing distractions is answering your question, getting rid of technology, putting the technology in a basket at the door and not picking it up when you come home, when you're with your children, not until they're asleep can you even look at it again. Things like, don't just sit and watch television all the time with your children. Do more interactive, creative, artistic things with them. Have an art bucket. Be more creative about your interactions with them. I could go on and on. Learn to listen to your children. Children express themselves not always verbally. A lot of it's nonverbal. Learning to read the cues and the signs of what they're saying to you, and learning to interpret what they're saying to you, either the behavior or the emotions. So there's a lot of practical things that are in the book. If people are interested, as you know, in the book there are lots of practical suggestions. But I would say the most practical thing I can say is choose a kind of work so women can work. We don't want to talk about this. Not all work is is easy for mothers.
Right.
There is some work that is just not as doable for mothers who want to prioritize their children. Things that are helping professions, things that are service professions, things that are in the educational field, things that are in consulting, things that are freelance. These are the fields that give us control and flexibility. What they used to call women's work. Being a teacher, being a nurse, being a psychotherapist, being a speech therapist, being an occupational therapist, being a freelance graphic artist, being anything you can do that you have control and flexibility over is far better. So if you think about those decisions before you even get into having a career, it helps a lot.
Yeah. And it seems like that's just becoming so much more of a realistic possibility for people. I mean, with technology, remote work is so much more possible, and it just seems in general that there just are a lot more options.
What's interesting is that I think I have a lot of sort of hope and faith in women that we have creative abilities to think out of the box and to be entrepreneurial. It is harder to work in big bureaucratic institutions that have rules that are not really meant for mothers. Yeah. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. I have patients who have worked around it for sure. They're lawyers, they've gone to law school, but even in their choices, they've had to make hard choices. Instead of making $1 million a year as a partner in a firm, they work on their own and have a couple of clients on their own, and so they make a couple $100,000. The other thing I encourage young women to think about is when you're dating someone, tell them that you want to have children. Tell them that you want to have a career too, but tell them that when you have children, you really only want to work part-time. Yeah. And that's a deal breaker. If that's a deal breaker for them, then they're not the right person for you. Because I think a lot of young women get confused and disoriented and maybe don't know, and tell their partners, I'm a hard-going lawyer, banker, whatever, doctor, and I'm going to make money and work straight through, and nothing's going to change when we have children. And they make these promises. I always say, don't make a promise you can't keep. And so to talk about this stuff before you marry someone, and make sure that you share a value system. And that, so what? So you don't have vacations in the early years. You go to the beach that's close to your house, or you don't get a second car, or you don't buy a house in those years. You rent. You don't buy fancy things. You save that for later in life when you're working harder. Those are good discussions to have early on in a relationship.
Yes.
People have those discussions, yeah.
Yeah, which is such an interesting, I think especially now, because society has expectations, and I'm sure it's very easy for couples to go into marriage thinking, well, my expectation is what it's going to be, right? Without ever verbalizing it, which is very dangerous, of course. And two, like you said, making that promise beforehand. I thought I knew how I would feel about working, but it's just different when you're a mom. And that's not to say that, I thought I was going to work and then I didn't, but it's just different. You have to be there to recognize what your needs are going to be, what your wants are going to be. So yeah, that's very important. That's really great advice. Yeah.
Even just to say, I've heard that having a baby is transformative. Why don't we tell women that? Having a baby is transformative. And that means that everything changes. Okay. And so I don't know how I'm going to feel. But I want to leave open the option that I may want to be with that baby, and I may not, but I may want to be with that baby. And if I do, you need to know that may be important to me.
Yeah.
And your partner may say, well, great, I share that value system, so let's not set up a really expensive lifestyle, a really expensive upper middle class lifestyle, or even middle class lifestyle that demands that we have a lot of material things in these years that we're raising young children. Those discussions are critical for happiness, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And two, like like we've kind of touched on a few times, I think it's just so important to recognize that there are seasons in motherhood and that you're always important. Your children's are always top priority, but it's okay to wait 10 years to write the book. It's okay to, right now I'm focusing on children. Right now I'm, taking the time, and it's okay if I focus later on work, and it's okay to, I just think it can be so consuming in those early years because it is a very full-time task to be with a baby. I think I had the thought of like, oh, during those 6 weeks of my maternity leave, I can get so much done. It's like, no, absolutely not.
It's immersive. The word I would use is immersive.
I love that. Immersive is
even your hormones dictate that it's immersive. You get something called maternal preoccupation, which is a hormonal preoccupation with your baby, where you actually, it's almost like a brain disorder in the days that following giving birth, where really nature means you to focus on your baby. And it actually takes a lot for women to shift away from their babies. And the problem is once they do shift away from their babies so dramatically, they cannot easily shift back. So once we fight our nature, then we actually create defenses that mean we don't necessarily, you can't easily go back and forth with that. And so that's a problem. If, you're feeling pulled towards your baby and you reject that and push away from it and create barriers because society tells you to, or your husband tells you to, or your mother-in-law tells you to, or your job tells you to, or some voice inside of you that's conflicted tells you to, you can't necessarily break down those barriers later.
Yeah. And the reality is that it is not true for the opposite. You can walk away from work and work will still be waiting there when you get back. The job's always going to be there, but babies don't stay babies.
That's right. There will always be jobs.
Yeah.
The same job. The other thing is that if having a baby is transformative, which it is, then you are also not exactly, the best analogy I can use is I can say this, I guess, because I'm guessing it's a lot of women listening to this. Once you have a baby, your bra size changes and it never goes back. Like I had to throw away all my old bras, even though your breasts grow and they shrink, but your back changes, your bones change, everything changes. So if you think about, you're never going to go back to the same bras that you had before, and you're never going to necessarily appreciate the work in the same way. It's going to be different. Right. And you might not even want to do the same work after. So the idea that it's transformative and you have to leave open the possibility that it makes you desire other things, other kinds of work, other ways of working. It changes your priorities if you let the instincts change your priorities. Yeah. Right? We're fighting our instincts as women. We're fighting the pull towards our babies. And that's actually causing a lot of postpartum depression, and it certainly is causing a lot of mental issues in children.
Okay, so my last question for you is just if you have any closing thoughts or general advice for moms who are in the early stage and trying to make that decision of, everything you've talked about has been advice, but any closing thoughts for moms, early moms?
I would say be kind to yourself. And if the people around you aren't being kind to you, I'm always seeing new patients who come in and say, I don't have support around me. I keep telling people I'm not happy with this balance that I've created. And all I get back is you got this fancy education, or you worked so hard to get here, or what a shame, or you make so much money, and what they're not getting is, I hear you. It's such a short time. It's such a beautiful time. You want to be with your baby as much as you possibly can be. Go for it. And so you have to be kind to yourself and surround yourself with people who are like-minded and can be kind to you. And if you don't have that support system, then you need to find it. You need to find it in other women who are like you. You need to find it in a therapist who listens to you and supports you. You need to learn how to communicate better with your spouse, to tell them what your needs are. My best advice would be in making these decisions, which are hard decisions, listen to yourself, but don't be alone in this. You cannot be alone in making these decisions. You have to have support.
Thank you, Erica, for sharing your journey as a mom, psychoanalyst, and researcher to share the value of motherhood. You can find Erica at Komisar.com and on Twitter at Erica Komisar CSW. Thank you, audience, for listening. You can connect with me and find show notes at themomspectrum.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Next week, join us to hear from Melissa Nahuleva, a mom who started her career at 18 years old to support her baby girl.